Hello, welcome to another video of Code Snippet, and in this video we are going to look into very important topic inside Spring Boot, that is Spring Cloud Config. It is very important when it comes to distributed microservice architecture or whenever you want to update your application properties at runtime. Well, let's get started without wasting any time. This is going to be another fun video, so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Alright, so let's quickly look into the agenda of this particular video. So Spring Cloud Config. And this is what we are going to look into this particular video. So first we will see the real world problem that Spring Cloud Config is trying to solve. After that we will look into what exactly is Spring Cloud Config and its architecture. After that we will see how we can implement config server, and after that we will see how we can use that config server inside config client. And at the end we will see how we can refresh properties using Actuator refresh inside our client. So that is basically the quick agenda of this particular video. So let's get started. So let's get started with real world problems in the project. So let me go to canvas over here. Now here consider you have a service, let's say a Spring Boot service, and you are running this particular service. You are deploying it in some cloud environment, let's say anywhere, be it on-prem, be it cloud. You are just going ahead and deploying it so that it's accessible to everyone, right? Now let's say this particular service, while running in cloud environment, it has a dependency on payment service. That means let's say user is placing some order, and in order to do payment, it is just redirecting it to your payment service. And what this service know about payment service? It just knows this URL of this particular payment service, that okay, I just need to redirect to this URL. And this particular URL is stored inside application.properties of this particular service. For example, this is the application.yaml or application.properties where we store YAML properties basically. So here it is stored something like this. Let's say payment service URL, and we have this HTTP URL over here, whatever it is, right? So like that it is stored, and whenever this service is getting an order, it will just redirect to this particular URL which is basically stored over here. But now let's say your payment service suddenly changes the URL. Now what you need to do? You need to make the changes over here inside your application.properties and redeploy your application inside this cloud so that the newly deployed application will be able to connect to the correct payment service by using correct URL. So that is basically a big problem. So for every configuration change, you will need to go ahead and redeploy your application. You need a core level changes. Now we always say that when we make use of application.yaml, we make things configurable. That means we will be able to change it in future. But whenever we change it, we need a code change. We still need a code change in application.yaml, and we need to redeploy the application inside your cloud in order for those changes to take effect inside your production environment. So that is basically the problem, right? So you need to go through all the cycle. You need to deploy to dev, stage, prod, and go through a testing cycle as well. So it's a lot of effort over here. Apart from that, let's say you have a microservice architecture. Let's say I have another service over here, and this service is again, let's say service B. This service B is again dependent on this payment service, and this is deployed to this cloud as well. Now when I change this URL in service A and deploy this application, it took effect, but I will also need to go ahead and make that change inside this particular service B, because service B is again using the same URL, and this URL is again stored inside service B's application.yaml. So I will need to go ahead and make changes in each service, because this configuration is basically duplicate inside each service. So that is again a problem of duplicate configuration. Now how we can solve this problem? How we can solve this problem? The answer is easy, by using Spring Cloud Config. And what Spring Cloud Config will do? It will externalize your configuration. When we say externalize your configuration, it will just put the configuration out of this particular service. It will not put it inside this particular service. For example, let's say you have some other service running over here. Let's say external service. So you have this external service running over here. What if when we deploy this application, these applications connect to this particular service to get the configuration? The configuration is not stored over here. Rather this service is responsible for configuration. And this service is again not storing configuration in its application.properties, because if this service started storing the configuration inside its application.properties, then we will still need to make code changes over here and deploy this particular service, isn't it? What if this service goes to a common place, let's say GitHub, and go ahead and connect to this GitHub to get the configuration? it is not storing the configuration on its end. It will just go to a GitHub repository or any other vault or any other place to fetch this configuration so that user can go ahead and change this configuration. So let's say I want to change this URL. What I will do, I'll just go to this GitHub repository and I will just go ahead and change that URL over here. This external service will fetch the new URL and it will provide it to this particular service, because this particular service is fetching from this particular external service. In that case, you don't really need any redeployment, and all the services that you have, your code will not be duplicated, your configuration will not be duplicated over here. So that is basically how your Spring Cloud config comes into picture. That is basically your real world problems, and that is how your Spring Cloud config solves this problem. So we have seen this basically, and let's basically move to Spring Cloud config and its architecture. Before that, let's quickly look into the definition of it. So Spring Cloud config is a framework that provides server-side and client-side support for externalized configuration in distributed system, right? So we are externalizing the configuration. It allows you to store all your application configuration in a central place like a GitHub repository, and lets multiple microservices fetch their configuration dynamically from a single source. That means you can just go ahead and change to this particular GitHub repository and it will be reflected inside your services. Well, how to do that? That we'll see in a moment. Now, if I go over here, so this is basically official documentation of Spring Cloud config, where you will find all the details that I'm giving you over here, right? So here is a quick start how you can start with Spring Cloud config. All these things are given over here in theoretical fashion. I will just go ahead and make it easy for you over here. So let's get started and let's look into the architecture of it. So let me go back over here in the canvas. So this is basically how it looks. So your Spring Cloud config have two major components, right? First one is config client. So here, if you see at the left hand side, you have these services. These services are referred as config client service, because it's a client who is going to receive the configuration, right? And the other service, the external service that we were talking about, is basically a config server. So other component is basically your config server. Now this config server will connect to an external configuration source. So if you see over here, we have a central place where we store the configuration. So it's a central place where we store the configuration. It could be a GitHub repository, it could be a vault, or it could be anything else. Like if you go inside AWS, it could be a parameter store or your secret manager as well. So there are many things where you can store the configuration. For starter, we will look into the simple GitHub example. So now your config server will connect to this particular GitHub repository. Now your GitHub repository will have application.yaml files, be it your main application.yaml or be it your application-dev.yaml, right? Can be anything. So it can be environment specific as well. So you can just go ahead and store it over here, where application is basically name of your application and dev is basically the environment of your application, right? So what you do when you create a config server, you mention this particular URL of GitHub repository inside this particular server, and it will be able to connect to it. So if I go back over here, then inside your config server, you can just go ahead and add this particular configuration, which says Spring Cloud config server and git URI. So this URI will be added over here. And once you do that, your config server will expose such URLs. Let's say localhost 8888 is basically port. And when I say slash, who is basically application name, development is basically environment. So that is how you will access it. So slash application slash profile. So application is basically the name of your application.properties. This is basically the name application, and the environment is basically dev.yaml. Now let me go to Spring Initializer, and you can just go ahead and create a simple project in order to create a config server. Let's say server, right? And here you need to add a dependency of config server. So I'll just say config server. So this particular dependency you'll need to add, and you can just go ahead and generate this project and open it inside your IntelliJ. So I have already exported and opened it inside my IntelliJ. So this is basically the project, Spring Cloud config server, right? And here, if you see, we don't really have much over here in this particular project. We have this application.properties and we have this particular application.yaml. And here, if you see, we have added this particular configuration, Spring Cloud config server, git, and URI is basically a URI of a GitHub repository. So that is how you can just simply go ahead and add this configuration. So now your config server will connect to GitHub, it will go ahead and fetch the configuration and store it at the server. Now whenever we create a config client, this config client fetches the information from this particular server while we are deploying this particular client. So this particular service, when it starts up, it will go ahead and fetch all the configuration from this server and use it inside its project. That is basically how it works, and that is how your simple architecture looks like. It is pretty simple and basic stuff. Now if I go back over here, then let's quickly see server implementation. So this config server implementation, we will quickly see how it works. Now here, if you see, this is how you can add a config server, and I already highlighted that this is basically the configuration and this is how it looks. Now let me just remove this particular configuration and run this code. And one more thing to highlight over here is I have created this project inside my GitHub. So if I go back over here, you will see that this particular config repo is created, and this particular config repo have two files. One is application.yaml, where I have just added a simple configuration. Let's say app.name, which is application, and inside application-dev.yaml I have added another configuration which is app.name, and here I have added the value as dev application. So we'll try to access this particular configuration from our config server. So this is basically the repo, and this URL I have mentioned inside this particular URI, Spring Cloud Config Server Git URI. Now our application is running basically. So started this particular application and it is running on 8888 port, this particular port basically. If you see over here, Tomcat started on this port. Now I can just go ahead over here and let's try to hit that particular endpoint. So I'll just say localhost colon 8888, and I will give the name of the application. In this case, the name of the application is basically application over here. I'll just say application, and I can just go ahead and say default. The environment is basically default. So if you want to access the configuration from this application.yaml, then it's a default environment. You can just go ahead and see it over here. So application.profile. And now if I hit this URL, let's see what happens. There we go. So if I click on this, you will see that we are getting this configuration. So if I go back over here, then in this format, we will just get this configuration, right? Same format basically. And here, if you see, we will see what exactly is the configuration. So app.name is basically application. You will see the name of the GitHub repository, application.yaml file. And this is basically the configuration. If I want to get the configuration from dev environment, I'll just go ahead and say dev over here and hit it again. Let's say pretty paint, and here you will see that we are getting the configuration from dev as well over here, as well as we will get the default configuration as well. But this will have precedence if you run your application inside dev profile, right? That is how it works. Now we are getting this configuration as well. So that is how you can go ahead and start your config server. So what I did, nothing much basically. I just added this particular configuration. I just added the port, and I have provided the GitHub repository URL over here, and that basically created a Spring Cloud config server for us. If I go back over here, then this part is basically done, this and this part we have successfully seen, right? Now let's say if I want to update this configuration, what I will do, I'll just go ahead to this application.yaml. I'll say dev application, and let's try to say updated. Now here what I'll do, I'll just push this code again. So what I'll do, I'll just say git add, I'll add a commit message, and let me quickly push it. There we go. So the changes are pushed basically. So if I go inside this again, then you will see that it is updated. Now if I go ahead and refresh this, and let's say pretty paint, then you will see that the configuration is updated. That means each time we request this configuration, each time this config server requests this configuration, it will fetch the newly updated configuration from your GitHub file and put it inside your config server. That means you have your configuration updated always. So that is basically how your config server works. So this part we have seen, right? Config server and GitHub. So this much part we have already seen. Now let's try to look into config client. So we have seen the architecture, we have seen the config server implementation. Let's quickly look into config client implementation now. So let's go ahead over here inside Spring Initializer, and let's create a Spring Cloud config client. So I'll just give the project name as Spring Cloud config, and this time we will just create a client. And here I will just say code snippet, so that our group will be code snippet over here. I'll just go ahead and remove this dependency. We don't want server side dependency now. What I'll do, I'll first give Spring Web so that we can add APIs over here. After that, I will just go ahead and add config client dependency. So this is an important dependency over here, Spring Client. And I'll just go ahead and say generate. I'll just unzip it and open it inside my IntelliJ. So there we go. I have opened this particular project inside my IntelliJ, and here if you see, what do we have? We don't have much. We will just have an application client, and here we will have resources application.properties, nothing much. If I go inside pom.xml, then you will see that we have this particular web dependency and we have this particular Spring Cloud starter config dependency. And if you compare it with pom.xml of your server, then you will have Spring Cloud config server over here. And here in the client, you have Spring Cloud starter config basically. So this is basically now your client. Now here in this client, let's go ahead and add a new file. Let's say application.yaml. Now this particular YAML is basically YAML file of this particular client. But here we are not going to add this configuration. Let's say this particular configuration, which is your app.name. We want to access it from this particular URL, basically this particular config server that we have created, right? Now, if I go back over here inside this particular quick start guide, then you'll see client side usage. This is basically something that we have already added. And if I scroll down over here, then here you will see that this is how you can import the configuration. Spring config import. We have optional : config server and the URL of your config server, right? So this is what we need over here. So I'll just go ahead and paste it over here, but it should be in YAML format now. So what I will do, I will just say Spring, and here I will just say config. Here I will just say import. Here we need to add this particular string basically. Now our URL over here is basically localhost : 8888 because our server is running on this particular port. And now let me just remove this. Now here, what do we need? We need a name of our application as well. So I'll just say application, and application name is, let's say, application over here, because this particular name should match the file of your YAML file over here. Application is basically your application name. So if you have order service, then it will be order service -dev.yaml. Now we have application, so we'll just give the name as application over here. And we will just import this config. Now, in order to test, let me just add a controller. So I'll just add a new Java class over here. And let me quickly add this controller, simple controller basically. What it will do when we say /config, it will just go ahead and print this /config, and the config is basically coming from app.name, which is basically configuration inside our GitHub, right? So it's a configuration app.name is inside our GitHub repository. Now what I'm doing, I'm just saying app.name over here, and this app name should be printed over here when we just fetch this URL. Simple stuff, right? So we have added this controller as well. Now let's go ahead and run this application. So let's run this client now. Let's see what happens. So our client is basically up and running on 8080 port. So if you see over here, our client is running on 8080 port. Now if I go back over here and say localhost : 8080/config, because this is basically the API we have added inside our controller, right? So this is basically the config API. Now if I hit this, typo basically, now if I hit this, you will see that the app name for config server is basically application. So it is loading from the default configuration, this one basically, because our application is running inside a default profile. So if you see over here, this is basically the profile which is default, right? If you need to run in dev environment, you can just do that, right? How we can do that? Now, in order to run this application inside dev profile, you can just go ahead and specify profile over here. So you can just say spring.profiles, and you can just give active profile over here. Let's say dev. And now if I rerun this code, let's see what happens. Active profile is basically dev, and our application is running in a dev environment. And if I go back over here now and try to refresh this particular URL, then you will see that the configuration is being updated from our dev properties. So this one basically. So that is how it simply works. And here, if you see in the logs, when we start our application, it says fetching config from server at this particular server. So it is fetching all the configuration from our config server basically. So it will fetch for all the environments. So it will fetch for default plus the environment in which we are running, because it may be that some configuration is not available inside dev but available in default one. So it fetches everything basically, right? So that is how you can configure and implement your config client, right? Simple stuff. Now let's proceed and let's see refresh properties using this one. So now if I go back over here and let's try to change this again. So we'll just say dev application refreshed, right? So let's say we have refreshed this now. And now what I will do, I'll just push this again. I'll just say git add, we'll just add a commit message and let's try to push it. So it will push it in a second. So there we go. Now if I reload this code, it should be updated, right? Now let me go to this particular config URL and let's try to refresh. If you see now I'm trying to refresh it, but it is not being updated. Then what is the use? Then what is the use of having this, right? So initially we said that we don't need to redeploy these applications, but we are still not getting the refreshed one. Why we are not getting the refreshed one? So here if you see, the config server will refresh the URL. So now if I go ahead and load this config server URL, then you will see that it have fetched the refreshed one, right? The refreshed one is coming. But now when I'm trying to load the config server URL, it is not being updated. If I go back over here, so basically your config server only loads configuration once when it deploys the application, right? When we deploy the application, at that time only this configuration is loaded. Now if I go ahead and redeploy this configuration, let's try to redeploy it, then it will again go ahead and fetch the fresh configuration from this particular server basically. And now if I go ahead and refresh this code, then you will see that it is refreshed. Now it is being refreshed. But that is not something we want, right? We don't really want to redeploy our application inside the deployment server inside our cloud. That is basically our basic use case. So now that is when something called as Actuator refresh comes into picture, right? So what Actuator refresh will do, it will refresh your application properties. And while refreshing, what it will do, it will go ahead and fetch the configuration from your config server again. So Actuator will have a refresh URL. So it will be something like /actuator/refresh. And when we invoke this refresh URL, it will just go ahead and refresh all the config. Now let's see how we can enable this inside our client. So now if I go back over here, then first thing we need over here is to have a Actuator dependency. So let me just go ahead and paste it over here. So this is basically Spring Boot Actuator dependency. While creating your client, you can just go ahead and add dependency over here. Let's say Actuator, right? Spring Boot Actuator. And this is how it looks basically over here. When you export it, it will be automatically added it over here. And we need to enable this Actuator basically. Now, if you don't know what exactly is Actuator, I have already covered it as a part of this particular playlist. You can just go ahead and check it out. Now here we need to give the configuration of Actuator to enable it, which is management endpoint web exposure include. So include this refresh URL basically. And now let's try to reload this. Now we are redeploying our application. And now here if you see our application is running, and here if you observe, we have this exposing one endpoint beneath base Actuator. That means our Actuator is basically running by using this particular dependency, this particular configuration. So our refresh endpoint is enabled. Now let's try to hit that endpoint from our Postman. So let me go back to Postman. Let's try to hit this. It's an Actuator refresh endpoint. Now if you see, nothing is refreshed because we don't have anything updated. Now let me go back over here, and here if you see, if I try to refresh this, we are getting this particular configuration. Now let me go back to our dev one and let's try to update it again. So I will just go ahead and say dev application name, let's say, in order to update it, and let's try to push it now. So I'll just say git add, I'll say git commit, and I will just say git push. So it should have been changed. So if I refresh this particular tab, then you will see that it is basically changed. Now if I try to reload our config server, then you will see that it will be updated over here. But now if I try to update our config client, it is still refreshed, right? It is not updated. Now what we can do now, let's go ahead and hit our refresh endpoint. Before that, let's see what is going on over here. So if you see, when we hit refresh, it will again call your local host. Now let's try to hit refresh again. Now here if you see, this particular configuration is basically refreshed, and here if you observe, it is again hitting your config server and fetching all the configuration from there. And now if I go ahead and try to refresh this, and guess what, it is still not refreshing. So let's see what exactly is the problem now. So now when we make use of this actuator endpoint, this refresh endpoint, basically not every bean will be refreshed. Only the beans which are annotated with @refreshScope will be refreshed, right? So now what I will do, I will just go ahead and redeploy this application and let's see what happens this time. So now if I reload this, then it will fetch the new configuration because we have restarted our code. But now let's try to change this again. So I'll just say with refresh scope now, and let's try to update it again. Let me quickly push this. So it should have been changed by now. So if I reload this page, it is changed basically. Now if we see, it should be updated inside our server. If you see over here, it is updated inside our server. And if I try to reload this particular config, it is basically old config. Now let's try to hit the refresh API. Now our refresh API is basically completed. Now let's try to reload this page. Now if you see over here, configuration is basically changed over here. So another important annotation comes over here is basically refresh scope in order to refresh by using actuator, right? So very important stuff. Whichever bean you want to refresh, you can just go ahead and mark it by using refresh scope and it will just update the configuration accordingly. So that is how refresh works. So now if I go back over here, then we have seen refresh properties using actuator refresh as well. And that is how you can refresh your properties inside your config client. That is how you can make use of Spring Cloud Config. Now Spring Cloud Config comes in handy when we deploy your application inside AWS and when we make use of parameter store or secret managers, right? So this is basically the base on which we are going to build when we actually look into parameter store inside AWS, right? So this is basically very important and this is being used inside many projects inside your IT industry. And this is a very important framework provided by your Spring, right? Simple stuff basically. And we have seen that as well. So that is basically it for this particular video. If you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to Code Snippet. Share this video with your friends so that they also have idea about Spring Cloud Config. That's it for this video. See you in the next video.